Hello, everybody. I just wanted to get on here and talk a little bit about the Sarah Boone sentencing that just happened. It's obviously a true crime case that a lot of people are familiar with. If you're not, I'll do a very quick synopsis. I just have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this case. So anyhow, Sarah Boone is, I believe she's 47 years old right now. This case happened in February of 2020. She and her boyfriend, who had a very tumultuous relationship, his name was George Torres. They were drinking heavily. It seemed like both of them had alcohol addiction issues. And so they were drinking heavily and decided to play a game of hide and seek, which is bizarre. They're both in their 40s. And it wasn't even really like hide and seek because she was assisting him getting into his hiding place. But that's what she claims they were doing. So anyhow, so they're playing this quote-unquote hide and seek, and George or she, it's hard to say who, decided it would be funny to get into a suitcase. And mind you, they're both struggling with alcoholism. I believe he weighed like 103 pounds at the time, very short as well, and she weighed about like 100 pounds. She's now gotten heavier since she's been in prison from likely not drinking. But at the time, they're both malnourished. They're both in active alcohol addiction. So she helps him in the suitcase, or he gets in there, and then she zips it shut. And of course, because it's zipped shut, he can't get out of it, obviously. And so as she's as he's been in there longer, at first they're laughing about it. And then, of course, as he's struggling to breathe and begins suffocating, he starts asking Sarah to let him out. He's like, babe, I can't breathe, let me out of here. And she's you can tell in this, there's a video of this that you can watch. You can tell that she's, heavily intoxicated in this video. And she's like, for all you've done to me. And then he's like, Sarah, please, babe, I can't breathe. Like, he's not angry. He's like pleading for his life. And she's like, he's like, babe, I can't breathe. And she's like, that's what it feels like when you cheat on me. And like, she just, is being very cruel. She's taunting him and she's saying, F you and all this and that. And this goes on, and she's recording this, obviously. That's how we know that it happened the way that it did. And then there's like so initially they show like she records him in the suitcase, and then there's like a 10-minute pause and between the two videos, because she has a second video where she's like taunting him. She claims in between the first video and the second video that George Torres starts threatening her, and that the reason she ends up leaving him in the suitcase to essentially die is because she was afraid for her life, because she says she has battered spouse syndrome. Now, there's no doubt that Sarah has likely suffered some abuse at the hands of George. However, she was also abusive, and I would argue she was the primary aggressor. And that's something that George cannot say his side of the story because he's not alive, obviously. So anyhow, she leaves him in the suitcase and goes upstairs and goes to bed, and then finds him the next morning deceased in the suitcase. I would highly encourage, if you're not familiar with this case, to watch the video. It's hard to watch. Don't say I didn't warn you, but it gives you a lot of perspective on how heinous and cruel this crime was. So, Sarah Boone was, because she had those videos, thank goodness she recorded it, because had she not, I don't think she would have ever been arrested for this crime. Now, so she had recorded this, and I don't think she was aware those videos existed when she went to the police station the next day, because I think she would have deleted them had she been aware of them. But of course they subpoenaed for her phone records, and then they found the videos, and then at that point they arrest her because it's clear that it's not an accident. So she gets arrested. She ends up, she is a very unique person, and she ends up going through like 8 public defender attorneys. I think they even ventured into the private sector for attorneys, but nobody could really deal with her because she was so argumentative and just kind of delusional and out of touch when it came to the facts of her case, and how, you know, I think she wanted a lawyer to tell her that like she didn't do anything wrong and that everything would be fine. And finally she put out an ad once the judge had determined she had exhausted all of her chances of having a public defender represent her. And then she ends up, actually an attorney ends up responding to her ad that she put out on court TV. And his last name Owens, and he actually was a really good attorney, and he did represent her. He claims she's going to pay him back, but I don't see how that's possible. But anyway, this story is really long and very nuanced, and I could really go on, but you get the gist. So she was actually offered a plea deal of 15 years, and she would have gotten credit for time served, which she's already served almost 5 years. So she would have served 10 years more, plus I think you actually only serve like 80% of your sentence. She would have ended up serving like maybe 7 more years with that plea deal. And instead she's like, nope, I'm going to trial. So she was charged with second-degree murder, and she was convicted in a record amount of time. It was a 2-hour conviction process. Or deliberation, I should say, with the jury, which is like a record for a murder case in the state of Florida. So that video is just something that you can't get around. Now, Sarah's defense was battered spouse syndrome, and honestly, I understand why the judge allowed her to use that defense, because the evidence against her was so strong that he probably just wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt for, like, you know, protecting against appeals and whatnot. But in order to claim battered spouse syndrome, the victim in the case, who she's kind of claiming is also a perpetrator, has to have some kind of overt act that put her in fear. And so her claim, and I thought this was the most ridiculous part of it to me, Sarah Boone claims that there was a little area of the suitcase where the zipper was open, and that he stuck his hand outside the suitcase, and that scared her enough to put him in the suitcase and leave him to die. Now, it's interesting to me because she's claiming it's an like, at first she claims it's an accident, like she had no idea that she had like left him in there, or that she passed out drunk. But when you're claiming battered spouse syndrome, it's kind of contradictory to that scenario, because you're saying, well, I was so scared that I had to do something. It's kind of like if you were a battered spouse, like your husband, let's say, you know, regularly beat you, and you went through those cycles of violence where, you know, things escalated, you guys would have an episode of violence, and then you'd have the honeymoon phase, and, you know, there's the whole cycle of domestic violence. Now, if you're saying that, it would be like, let's say my husband beat me and then I shot him because let's say he was holding a knife to my neck, and so I shoot him. Of course, I think most people would say that was warranted, and I probably wouldn't be charged with a crime. Now, the problem here is, by using the battered spouse syndrome defense, she's kind of in a way admitting that she intended to kill him by leaving, because she claims like, oh, I was so scared that I left him in the suitcase. She also claims he started threatening her in that 10 minutes, conveniently in the 10 minutes where there's no video. And it's like, he wasn't sounding aggressive at all in the video. Like, he was very much like pleading for his life. Like, please, Sarah, let me out. You know, I can't breathe. He kept saying he couldn't breathe. He wasn't angry. He sounded just like he was just desperate to be let out. And it's like, the defense's case was basically like, well, because he dared to put his hand out of the suitcase to try to get out, that was justification for her to essentially kill him, which is like absurd. Like, somebody locked me in a suitcase, which would never happen because I'm 6 feet tall and, you know, many more pounds than 100. But anyway, hypothetically, like, I'm just supposed to sit in there and suffocate, and because I don't want to make this person nervous that I'm going to hurt them, I'm not allowed to try to get out? It's like, it's very absurd if you even say it out loud. So anyhow, as you can imagine, so she's sentenced for convicted of second-degree murder, and today was her sentencing. So, of course, at a sentencing, you have victim impact statements, you have, you know, the family of the victim is able to speak. George Torres had several children. His daughter spoke about him. His mother spoke about him. It was very sad. And then, of course, Sarah Boone herself has the opportunity to speak. And, oh my gosh, like, of course, this is typical Sarah Boone fashion. I'm not surprised that she did this, but I was kind of thinking, like, well, maybe she'll take her attorney's advice and try to show remorse. But no, Sarah Boone, I mean, it was basically like, I forgive George Torres for everything he did to me, and I forgive his family, and she painted herself out as a victim. I think she is so narcissistic that she just thinks that she's going to finally convince someone to see it her way. And I don't think, even though she technically apologized, she never really admitted to doing anything wrong. And it was honestly, like, mind-blowing. It was almost like she would rather get a life sentence than show remorse or, you know, admit to her actions, take responsibility. And so one of the things that has always bothered me about this case is she testified in her own defense, which is unusual. Usually they tell defendants not to testify. But one of the things that she's claiming, and this is something I just feel really strongly about pointing out, so she painted herself in her trial to be this, like, domestic abuse survivor victim, and made George Torres out to be like this monstrous person. However, she had a lot of video footage of George, and a lot of it showed her being the aggressor. It showed George as a more timid person. He didn't seem to anger easily. And when, on the rare instance in those videos where he would get a little bit angry, it was like she would push his buttons to the point where, I don't care who you are, you would eventually, like, get upset. Kind of a good example would be, like, if I knew something really bothered you, like, let's say you were really self-conscious about your teeth, and so I start making comments about your teeth just to get under your skin, and initially I'm like, initially you're very calm about it, you're trying to let it go, and then as the taunting gets worse and worse, and as you start picking at the person, eventually, you know, you're basically like saying, I dare you to hit me. Like, that's how it felt in these videos. You know, and you can watch the trial on Court TV. I would highly encourage people to do so. But it was very much just like she picked things that she knew would bother him to get a reaction out of him, so she could say, like, basically, I dare you to hit me, I dare you to hit me. And then if he would eventually, after she's in his face berating him, that just so she could say, like, look what you've done to me. And so here's the two things she likes to bring up. So there was a video shown in court of George Torres smashing her TV, or their TV. They had lived together in this townhouse. But if you watch the video, it looks to me like that TV was probably already broken and that she agreed to allow George to smash it just like for fun. And the reason I say that is because they set up the video like it was planned. Like, okay, are you ready? Like, we're going to start recording now. If your fiance, boyfriend, whatever is angry and he's smashing a TV, you're not going to be like, okay, let's wait for like the recording to be set up. And that's exactly how it was. It was like he was waiting to start smashing it until she was recording it. And nobody really brings this up. And it to me, it's so obvious that it wasn't George in like a violent, because obviously like smashing property is obviously, that is domestic violence. And that's what always bothered me too about the Johnny Depp trial. And, you know, maybe unpopular opinion, but when he's drunk and smashing all those cupboards and whatnot, even though like I believe that Amber Heard also had culpability in that case, you can't say that Johnny Depp did not participate in any kind of domestic abuse, because that in itself is. And so when she's using the property smashing, that to me is like, it is abuse, but it's not abuse when you guys plan to do it because the TV's already broken. And of course he's not alive, so she can spin anything the way that she wants to spin it. And that's another one. Like, if you have a chance to watch a trial, I would highly recommend, it was during I guess they showed the video a couple times. But the defense kind of leaned on that video as a way to show like his violent tendencies. And it's like, no, it very much appears like she was the one who said like, yeah, you can do that. Like, it's broken anyway. So I wanted to point that out. The other thing I wanted to point out is, because a lot of people too, even now, like, she's obviously like, Sarah Boone as a defendant is not well liked. But after she testified on her own behalf and talked about the domestic abuse, a lot of people were kind of like, well, you know, she was abused. And I'm not saying she was or she wasn't. Like, I think that she was the primary aggressor. She was very controlling. She had, she owned the place they lived in, and so she could kick him out at any given moment. And she would kick him out and then file a restraining order and then try to lure him back in and then report him for violating this restraining order. Like, that's the type of stuff she did. And so she had the control over the housing. She had the control over the money. Like, George actually worked at Ace Hardware at some point during the relationship, I believe at the time of his death. But I don't think he got enough hours. And she didn't work at all. She was living off of alimony payments from her ex-husband, Brian Boone. And she had one son, which is very sad, just to think of what he's going through. But George Torres, she talked to him like a child. She would talk about like setting up arts and crafts for him to do. And it was very much like she controlled him on all aspects of his life. And so, that is abuse too, when doesn't always have to just be physical abuse. And so the other thing that a lot of people that Sarah Boone herself kind of brings up all the time is she had gotten stabbed in her leg, and it was pretty severe. And it looks like it took her a while to get medical attention. She claims George Torres stabbed her. However, the story given to the hospital was not that George Torres stabbed her. It was that the two of them were like messing around and it was an accidental stabbing. Now, of course, Sarah Boone, because she's got this medical report that stems from her leg being stabbed, now is going to say, well, it wasn't an accident. He stabbed me in a fit of rage, and I just pretended it was an accident because he would have let me seek medical care. The thing is, I don't doubt that George Torres could turn into a douchebag when he was drinking, or maybe get violent. But when you look at these videos of him highly intoxicated, that was not his MO. Like, he was very kind of calm and submissive. And I do not believe, and here, let me also say that I think domestic violence victims, man or women, should generally be believed. I think it's rare that victims of domestic violence lie about their abuse. I do think there's a very small subset of men and women, specifically more women, just because more women are abused generally, that lie about their abuse for their own benefit. There was recently a case of a woman named Lori Shaver who murdered her husband, who I believe lied about the way he treated her in order for her to try to justify his murder, which she, the jury did not believe her. Same with the Ashley Benefield case. She murdered her husband and tried to claim it was self-defense, but the evidence showed that he was turned away from her. She had sent her mom and her daughter to a park, and it seemed planned. And that's a very long, complicated case. But my point being is that there are a lot of times where, or there's some cases where women use the fact that we do give victims the benefit of the doubt, as we should, in their favor, because they want to be acquitted of a crime or they want sympathy. And that, to me, is the case here. Is I think I'm not saying George was a saint. I'm not even saying that he never hit her. But if you watch the videos, and these are all videos she's taken of him, it's like the videos don't ever actually show him hitting her that I could see. Like, I don't remember seeing him ever hit her. And, especially with this knife incident, it seems to me more likely that they were drunk and screwing around, and she, maybe they're sword fighting with knives, because these two were very severe alcoholics, so I'm sure they would get blackout drunk and do stupid things. Like, we know that they did because of the suitcase incident. So I have a really hard time seeing George Torres, if you watch these videos, being angry with her and whipping out a knife and being stabbing her. It just seems really not likely. And as a matter of fact, Sarah would be being very mean to him and aggressive, and he would still stay calm in many of these videos. So a lot of people, when they're talking about this case, were like, oh, well, she was abused, she was stabbed in the leg, she was this, she was that. I'm not saying he never did anything violent or aggressive towards her, but I think those two incidences, the smashing of the TV and the stabbing, I don't believe her, because the thing is she didn't even tell the hospital that she was stabbed yet, or stabbed by George, I should say. And it was a gnarly wound, but she claims she was bleeding out in the bathroom and she had to beg George to let her go to the hospital, and they had to make up this story. But the thing is she never had a problem telling the police when George did violent things to her. As a matter of fact, she had the cops on speed dial. And again, she would use these tactics where she knew there was a restraining order in place, so then she lures him to her home, or not lures, but invites him over, oh, I miss you, I want to see you. And then he comes, and then she has him arrested. And so it's anyway, those two things, because I don't hear anybody else, I hear everybody talk about this as George stabbed her in the leg, and that's a fact, and George smashed the TV, and that's a fact. And we don't know that he stabbed her in the leg. And the fact that he's not here to refute that in any way, I'm not going to give Sarah Boone the benefit of the doubt, because she's not credible. she lies constantly, and so I have no reason to believe she's not lying about this. So the battered spouse syndrome, to me, it was very much a slap in the face to actual victims of domestic violence. I know they say that in a domestic violence relationship, there's always like one person who's, wielding the power over another, and it can't just be like an equal culpability relationship when it comes to the violence. I think that, this case is really unique just in general to begin with, but I would venture to say that in this relationship, that Sarah Boone was the person with all that power. She had financial power over him. She had the housing. She had, she would buy him. Here's another thing too. She would buy him things, like she bought him a bike, and then she would use the fact that she bought him the bike as against him. And I believe once when they had like broken up, that she, I don't know if she took the bike away from him, but she bought him it for a gift, and then it's like her whole point of giving it to him was so that she could control him by saying, well, I gave this to you, and so you only have that because of me. And it's very, like, there are narcissists, and I actually know one or two in my life, that give things to wield that power to be able to use against you in the future, to say, like, look, I gave that to you. Or they want to come across as a certain type of a person, like, oh, I'm a really giving person. And I want to say that they're called noble narcissists. Like, so people think they're a really good person, right? They might donate to charity if they have that kind of money. They might do work for, organizations like the Red Cross or something like that. But the only reason they're doing it is because the way that it makes them look to the outside world. It isn't because they really care about helping other people. It's all about the perception and being able to tell people that you do it, and being able to go there wearing the shirt. And it's just, she very much reminds me of somebody like that. Now, she was evaluated by two different prison psychologists, one for the defense and one for the prosecution. They both actually agreed that she had narcissistic traits. Neither of them would actually say she had a narcissistic personality disorder. I don't know. The one that saw her for the prosecution saw her in prison for like a couple of hours. So I think it's hard for them to get a really good take on her as a person. And then the psychologist that's working for the defense, I just think that she has, she's being paid, many thousands of dollars. And I think she has a lot of incentive to not give her that complete diagnosis. So anyhow, the sentencing hearing of Sarah Boone was, of course, George Torres' family gets up and they say all these nice things about him and how much they miss him. And one of his family members did say, like, I don't hate Sarah Boone, but I hate what she did. And one of his kids was like, I hope she rots in prison. She was more angry. It was overall, sentencing hearings can be really sad because of the victim impact statements. But Sarah Boone, of course, gets a chance to speak. And I know I already talked about in the beginning, but she basically presented herself as a victim and made it seem like George kind of brought it upon himself. And I don't know if Judge Kranick already had his sentence in mind, but I would imagine, like, a lot of judges might say, okay, I'm going to give this person life unless they really show some kind of remorse. So that's the thing. So she was offered this plea deal, right, where she would have served maybe like 7 more years. And instead, and she's 47, so just to give you some context, she'd get out when she's 54. She would still have some life ahead of her, most likely. But now, because she refused that, the second-degree murder range is 22 years to life. And I don't think Florida has a parole for murder. I want to say that they don't. I've never heard them give a possibility of parole that I can think of. I'm trying to think of what case I just watched a while back that the person got the possibility of parole. That was Robert Tejas, and that was in Nevada. So yeah, I'm pretty sure Florida does not have the parole. I don't know if they do for like other offenses, but I don't think they offer parole for murder. So it's like if you get a life sentence, there's no life sentence with the possibility of parole. It's just a life sentence. So she got life, and I don't know this for a fact, obviously, but I think that it's possible Judge Cranick could have thought, or could have been thinking like, well, if she says, if she really takes responsibility, if she doesn't portray herself as a victim, if she really comes across genuine, like maybe I would say 30 years. Like maybe he had a contingency backup plan based on what she would say. I would imagine that maybe not all judges, maybe some judges completely have their mind made up. But he didn't. One thing that I really like it when judges get into like what the defendant said and then what their whole thought process was for the sentence. Some judges will really get into all of that, and some judges won't. He really didn't. He was very much just like, this is what your sentence is. He really didn't get into like, well, you just got up there and portrayed yourself to be the victim when you're not. In this case, you are the perpetrator. I mean, I think the sentence speaks for himself as to what he thought, but there's a judge named Jennifer Duro that works in Wisconsin. She presided over the Darrell Brooks case, and then she also presided over the Jesse Kerchevsky case. And in particularly the Jesse, you might not be familiar with it, but it doesn't really matter. But she was at her sentencing hearing. She really spoke. She spoke for like an hour about like her thoughts on everything and why she ends up giving her, like, she was in her 40s and she gave her life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, because she was basically like, well, I think in your 80s you will be not a threat to society anymore. But I really like it when they get into all of that, and this judge really didn't do that, because I really was curious as to like what his personal thoughts were about the case. He's an awesome judge. Like, he's one of my favorite judges. But anyway, yeah, the Sarah Boone case has concluded. Obviously, she can appeal. She, I'm sure, will write many, many letters to the court that will eventually become public. And maybe I'll read some of those one of these days. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about that case and share my thoughts. And I'm not surprised. Well, I wasn't sure about the life sentence. I guess after her victim impacts, or not, she's not victim, I'm sorry. After her statement in sentencing, I'm not surprised about the life sentence. I think she would rather serve a life sentence than take responsibility and show true remorse for her actions. So, another case that was going on today is the case of, what is her name? Oh, Jamie Komorowski, who was, well, initially, this happened in 2020. I think she served several months in jail and then got out on bond after the trial kept getting delayed. But anyway, the case there was, this is a terrible case. In South Carolina, a bride and groom were getting married, and they had just concluded their reception, and they were headed on a golf cart in an area that obviously I'm not familiar with South Carolina, but in terms of like this area, but it sounds like a lot of golf carts would drive in this area, which is why the speed limit was only 25. And so the bride and groom are being driven from their reception back to where they're going to stay. And a 23-year-old, very, very drunk driver named Jamie Komorowski plows into this golf cart and kills the bride on her wedding night. I mean, that's about as horrific as it gets. The groom was severely injured, and the other passengers, I think there were 4 of them in total on the golf cart, and the other passengers were more mildly injured, but what is her name? I should know the victim's name more than the perpetrators. It's coming to me. Her name is Samantha Miller. And Samantha Miller was the bride. And Jamie Komorowski was scheduled to start trial today for these murder charges. And instead, she agreed to plead guilty. And it's called a blind plea, where she leaves so it's like the state, I guess, works out a plea deal with the judge or something. I don't know. I guess I don't really understand exactly what it is. I don't know if they already know what her sentence is going to be and they just don't tell her until the day of, like, today, after this hearing that they're having, or if the judge decides the sentence after the hearing where they present. It's kind of like maybe a closing argument or something where each side kind of presents why, they think she should be convicted or not convicted, but sentenced to a longer time in prison. She's pleading guilty. She's not going to have a trial. But my understanding is with this blind plea deal, the judge decides her sentence, and she just has to kind of be at the mercy of the judge. I think she realized that no jury is going to look at her in a favorable light after she came from wealth, the perpetrator in this case, and there are a lot of jail phone calls where she's on video chats with her dad, basically saying things like, why did this have to happen to me? I mean, she does say she's sorry several times. Her blood alcohol level was 0.26, and that was like a couple hours after the crash. So, I mean, at the time of the crash, it was probably close to 0.3, which is nuts. So she was like blackout drunk. She was driving 65 and a 25. Like, that's nuts. So bananas, all the things. Like, I can't believe that. And, she just very much comes across as like a spoiled brat. And she's in for a rude awakening because I know she did serve, I want to say it was like 10 months, but I could be wrong on that. But she served several months in jail, and then now she's been out on bail. So she's going to go back to prison because it's not the county jail once you've been convicted. So but it was like, the thing is with her is her dad had a lot of money or has a lot of money, and he was able to just like tell her, like, look, we've got the best of the best attorney working on this. He kept telling her she did nothing wrong, which I thought was not a good look. Because, I mean, anytime, I don't understand what it is about, like, they tell you when you're calling, an inmate makes a phone call, it tells you, like, this is being recorded and it could be used against you in a court proceeding. And it's like, people, I don't know if they just can't help themselves by making these incriminating statements, but, like, even her dad, which obviously she has no control over what he says, but she kept saying she was sorry, like, the day that this like, when they first talked to each other in jail, like, the day it happened, or the day after, and she's still obviously highly upset. She kept saying she was sorry, and her dad just kept saying, oh, Jamie, you didn't do anything wrong, it was just a mistake. And it's like, she did do something wrong, yeah, I don't think she set out to kill this woman, but when you get blackout drunk and get behind the wheel of a car, it's, you know, in a way you kind of did set out to kill somebody, because it wasn't like you were just a little tipsy and, you know, you just got into an accident. This was like you were blackout drunk, probably had little to no memory of it the next day. So I'm interested to see what the sentencing is there. I think it's going on right now, and I wanted to mostly talk about Sarah Boone anyway. But yeah, if you have any thoughts about especially those two incidences I'd like to know people's thoughts on the stab wound to her leg that she always talks about as, you know, one of the main focuses on, or incidences of when she was abused, and then the smashing of the TV. If you guys had similar thoughts on that, or if you think I'm being unfair, yeah, that's just my thoughts and feelings on it. I want to talk about Delphi. I have a lot of things to say about the Delphi case, and I don't have time to do it right now because I need to go back to work, but I'm going to talk about, hopefully I can get something out by tomorrow, because I have really strong feelings about how the true crime community has affected that case, and why it's important what type of YouTube channels and Facebook pages and Instagram and all of that we're supporting when it comes to true crime, because it actually works its way into the courtroom. And so anyway, I'll talk about that later, but thanks for listening, and thanks for watching, depending on what source you're consuming this from. And yeah, I'm trying not to be the type of person that's like, oh, like and subscribe and all of that, but I figure if you want to, you will. So anyway, have a good day. Bye-bye.